A veteran Navy SEAL with nowhere left to go bought a broken cabin deep in the northern forest. He thought it was just a place to survive the winter, until his dog stopped at the hearth and refused to move night after night. The dog kept watching the same spot, like it wasn't empty at all. When the man finally looked closer, he realized the cabin wasn't abandoned. It was holding something no one else could see. And for the first time in years, he felt like maybe it wasn't the cabin that found him by accident. But what he discovered next didn't just change the house. It changed the man who had been running his whole life. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories. Rowan Hale had spent most of his life in places where survival was measured in seconds. At 43, he still carried that life in his posture. Broad shoulders held just slightly forward, as if braced against an impact that never quite came. He stood a little over 6 feet tall, his build lean but dense, with the kind of strength that didn't fade easily. His face was sharply cut, cheekbones defined, jaw strong, softened only by the rough shadow of an unshaven beard that never fully disappeared. His skin had the weathered tone of someone who had lived more under open sky than under a roof. His hair was short, military cut, dark brown threaded with early streaks of gray at the temples. It wasn't styled. It was maintained, practical, like everything else about him. And his eyes, blue-gray, held a depth that made people look away before they realized why. Not cold, not angry, just distant. Like someone who had seen too much to react the way others did. Rowan had once been a Navy SEAL, the kind of man trained to enter chaos and come out alive. But no one had trained him for what came after. There hadn't been a single moment where his life broke. No explosion, no letter, no betrayal, just erosion. A job that ended without ceremony. Another that didn't last. A room rented by the week, then by the day, then not at all. Conversations that never went anywhere. Faces that didn't stay long enough to matter. And the quiet realization that outside the structure of orders and missions, Rowan Hale didn't belong anywhere. Now he slept in his truck. It was an old Ford pickup, paint dulled by years of weather, interior worn but clean. Everything he owned fit behind the seats or in the covered bed. Tools, a canvas duffel, a few changes of clothes, a battered thermos, and a small metal box that held things he never opened. And Ash. The German shepherd lay stretched across the passenger seat, his body long and powerful, muscles defined beneath a coat of black and tan that was thick but trimmed for function, not show. He was 5, maybe 6 years old. Old enough to have seen things, young enough to still move like a shadow when he needed to. Ash's eyes were dark, focused, always moving. Even at rest, he wasn't still. His ears twitched at distant sounds. His nose lifted slightly at shifting scents. He tracked the world in ways Rowan never could. But what made him different, what made him more than just a trained K9, was the way he read Rowan. Ash knew the difference between silence and defeat. That morning, the dog hadn't moved when Rowan shut off the engine. A gas station on the edge of nowhere, wind pushing dust across cracked pavement, the smell of stale coffee and gasoline drifting through the half-open window. Rowan sat behind the wheel for a long time, hands resting loosely, eyes unfocused. He wasn't thinking about what came next. He wasn't thinking at all. That was the problem. When you stopped planning, you were already drifting. Ash lifted his head slowly, watching him. Rowan reached over, scratching behind the dog's ear without looking. A habit. A grounding point. "Yeah," he muttered quietly, voice rough from disuse. "I know." But he didn't. Not really. He found the listing 2 hours later. It wasn't luck. It was desperation wearing a thin disguise. A small office just past the gas station, a county building with faded paint, and a bulletin board cluttered with notices no one read anymore. Rowan had gone in for a map. He walked out with something else. A file. Thin, unremarkable. County reclamation property, the clerk had said. The man behind the desk was in his 50s, slightly overweight, with thinning hair and a polite but distracted expression. He wore a pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up and glasses that slipped down his nose every few minutes. His name tag read Daniel Pierce. Daniel spoke like someone who had explained the same thing too many times. Property was seized due to unpaid taxes, no utilities, no road access in winter. Structurally, questionable. He flipped through the papers without much interest. Been sitting there a long time. People look at it. No one commits. Rowan took the file. What's the catch? Daniel gave a small shrug. You buy it, you own the problem. County won't fix anything. You've got 5 years to make it livable or we take it back. He paused, glancing up properly for the first time, studying Rowan in a way that suggested he was trying to decide something. Then he added, almost casually, most folks don't last a winter out there. Rowan didn't react. He just nodded once. That all? Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. That's all. But something in the way he said it lingered. Not a lie. Just not everything. Rowan didn't press. He'd learned long ago. People told you enough. You just had to decide what mattered. The drive north took most of the day. Pavement gave way to gravel. Gravel gave way to dirt. Eventually, even that became a narrow track cutting through dense stands of pine and spruce. The forest opened in places, sunlight spilling down in long, clean beams, catching dust in the air like floating ash. It wasn't dark. It wasn't threatening. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't belong to absence, but to endurance. Rowan drove slowly, tires crunching over uneven ground. Ash stood now, braced on the seat, nose working the air through the open window. They both felt it before they saw it. The space, the clearing, and then the cabin. It sat slightly off-center in a patch of uneven grass, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the wind. The structure was small. Stone walls, gray and weathered, built by hand decades ago. The roof sagged in one corner, a section of it partially collapsed. The chimney leaned just enough to notice. 2 narrow windows faced the clearing. The glass was cloudy, streaked with time. The door, thick, oak, iron hinges rusted, but intact, hung closed. Nothing about it was inviting, but nothing about it felt abandoned either. Rowan turned off the engine. The sudden silence pressed in. He sat there for a moment, eyes on the cabin, measuring it without consciously doing so. Distance, structure, angles, entry points, old habits. Then he opened the door and stepped out. Boots hit dirt. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and something faintly metallic. Ash didn't follow. Rowan took 2 steps, then stopped. He turned back. The dog was still inside the truck, standing rigid, front paws planted on the seat, body angled forward but unmoving. Ears up, eyes locked on the cabin, not curious, not cautious, focused. Rowan frowned slightly. Ash. No movement. The dog didn't even blink. A gust of wind moved through the clearing, brushing past Rowan, stirring the grass. Ash reacted instantly. Not with a bark, not with fear. He took 1 slow step backward, away from the open door, and lowered his head just slightly, without taking his eyes off the cabin. Like something inside had just noticed them. Rowan watched him, something tightening quietly in his chest. Ash had been in worse places, louder places. Places that smelled of fire and blood, and men who wouldn't be leaving. and he had never reacted like this. Not once. Rowan turned back to the cabin. Nothing had changed. Same broken roof, same leaning chimney, same stillness. But the feeling was different now. Not danger. Not exactly. Recognition. He exhaled slowly. "Stay," he said, voice calm, steady. Ash didn't move. Rowan stepped forward alone. Each step felt deliberate, measured, not out of fear, but out of instinct. He approached the door, hand reaching out, fingers brushing against the rough wood. The surface was cold, slightly damp, worn smooth in places by years of use that had long since ended. He pushed. The door opened with a low groan. Inside, the air was cooler, dim but not dark. Light filtered through the dusty windows, illuminating floating particles that drifted lazily through the space. Rowan stepped in. Stone floor beneath his boots, rough walls, exposed beams above, and at the far end, the hearth. It dominated the room, far too large for a cabin this size, built from thick, uneven stones, blackened by decades, maybe more, of fire. The opening was wide, deep enough to step into. The mantel above it was cracked but still solid, a single slab of wood darkened with age. Rowan stood still, studying it. There was something about the proportions that didn't sit right. The room was built around it, not the other way around. Behind him, outside, Ash let out a low sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a warning. More like refusal. Rowan didn't turn around. He took a slow step toward the hearth, then another. The air shifted slightly as he approached, carrying the faint scent of old ash. Something deeper beneath it. Something held. Rowan stopped just short of the stone slab in front of the firebox. He didn't know why. He just did. For the first time in a long while, he felt something that wasn't emptiness. Not hope, not yet, but something close to it, like standing at the edge of something that had been waiting. Outside, Ash finally moved, but not forward. He stepped down from the truck and remained where he was, at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting, as if he already understood something Rowan hadn't, not yet. The cabin did not change overnight. That was the first thing Rowan understood as the light shifted across the floor the next morning. Nothing had moved in any obvious way. No doors opened, no objects displaced, no signs of intrusion. And yet, something was different. Rowan stood just inside the doorway, boots planted on the cold stone floor, eyes scanning the room the way he had been trained to do. Slow, methodical, deliberate. Every angle, every shadow, every line that didn't match what it had been before. He didn't need to look long. The difference was small, too small for most people to notice. But Rowan had never been most people. The stone slab in front of the hearth had shifted. Not enough to see from across the room, not enough to trip over. Just enough. A fraction of an inch, maybe less. But it broke the pattern. The symmetry of the floor was no longer perfect. Rowan stepped closer, his movement quiet, controlled. He crouched slightly, running his fingers along the seam where the slab met the surrounding stone. Cold, smooth, too smooth. There should have been roughness, age, crumbling mortar. But instead, the edge felt almost deliberate, like it had been shaped to fit exactly. He leaned in, studying it. The rest of the floor was uneven, worn down over time. But this section, this slab, was intact, dense, unyielding, as if it had been placed there, not built around. Rowan exhaled slowly. "Not random," he murmured. Behind him, Ash stepped into the cabin. The dog's paws made almost no sound against the stone. His body moved low, alert, every muscle engaged but not tense. Controlled readiness. His coat caught the morning light, black along the spine fading into warm tan along his sides and legs. Ash circled once, then stopped directly in front of the hearth. Not sniffing wildly, not searching, just focusing. Rowan watched him. Ash lowered his head slightly, nose hovering just above the stone slab. He inhaled once, slow and deep. Then he sat, perfectly still. The kind of stillness that didn't belong to rest, but to attention. Rowan stood up and moved away from the hearth, not because he was afraid, but because he knew better than to rush something that didn't want to be rushed. He stepped outside instead. The air was sharp, clean, pine and damp soil. The kind of scent that cleared the mind whether you wanted it to or not. The clearing stretched wider than it had seemed the day before. Morning light revealed more detail. Patches of wild grass flattened by wind. A narrow trail leading deeper into the trees, and beyond that, a faint shimmer that might have been water. A lake, maybe. Rowan took it in without moving. He had chosen this place because it was empty. But standing there now, he realized something else. It wasn't empty. It had just been left. There was a difference. By midday, Rowan was working. Routine, structure, those were things he could still rely on. He pulled tools from the truck, crowbar, hammer, gloves worn soft at the palms. He checked the roof first, climbing up along the side with practiced efficiency. The wood was old but not rotten through. Some sections would need replacing, but the frame held. He moved to the chimney, cracked but stable. Everything about the cabin said the same thing. It had been neglected, but not destroyed. That meant something. It meant someone had built it well enough to last long after they were gone. Rowan climbed down, brushing dust from his hands. Ash had not moved. Still in front of the hearth, still watching. By late afternoon, Rowan decided to drive back toward the main road. Not far, just enough to confirm the route, mark distance, and check how long it would take in bad weather. Ash jumped into the truck this time without hesitation, settling into the passenger seat, though his eyes lingered on the cabin until it disappeared behind the trees. The road out was rough, but manageable. 10 minutes later, Rowan reached a fork he didn't remember seeing the day before. A narrower path veered off to the right, half hidden by brush. He slowed the truck. Ash lifted his head immediately, ears forward, focused. Rowan glanced at him. "You see it too." He turned onto the path. The trail wound through denser trees, branches scraping lightly against the sides of the truck. After a few minutes, it opened into a small clearing. A structure stood there. Not a house. A shed, maybe. Or what was left of one. Weathered wood, leaning slightly, roof partially collapsed. It looked older than the cabin. Or at least more exposed. Rowan stepped out. Ash followed, moving ahead this time, nose low to the ground. There were footprints. Old, faded. Not recent, but not decades old either. Rowan crouched, studying them. Human, boots. Size hard to tell. Direction unclear. He stood slowly, so, not completely abandoned. Ash suddenly stopped. Mid-step. His body stiffened, not in fear, but in recognition. He turned his head sharply toward the shed. Then, without waiting for a command, he walked straight to the door and sat. Not scratching, not barking, just waiting. Like he had done the same thing somewhere else before. Rowan approached carefully. The shed door hung crooked, one hinge rusted through. He pushed it open with the edge of his boot. Inside, the air was thick with dust and old wood. Nothing valuable. No tools worth keeping. Just remnants, broken crates, a rusted lantern, scraps of cloth. Rowan stepped in, scanning. Ash remained at the threshold, watching, not entering, Rowan noticed that. "You don't like this one?" Ash didn't move. Rowan crouched near the back wall. There, half covered by debris, was a small metal object. He pulled it free. A hinge. Old, heavy, iron. But not from the shed. Too solid, too well made. Rowan turned it over in his hand. Something about it matched the feeling he had in the cabin. Not the look. The intention. This had been part of something built to last. Something hidden. He slipped it into his pocket. "Not junk," he said quietly. Ash finally stepped inside, just enough to sniff the ground once. Then he turned and walked back out. Decision made. They returned to the cabin as the light began to fade. The sky shifted toward a colder blue. Shadows stretched longer across the clearing. Rowan shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening. Nothing. Just wind through trees. He stepped out. Ash jumped down beside him, then moved ahead, straight to the cabin door. This time, he didn't hesitate. He went inside. Rowan followed. The interior felt different again, not in a way he could define. Just closer. He walked toward the hearth. The slab was still slightly shifted, exactly as before. No more, no less. He stood over it. Ash sat beside him. For a long moment, neither moved. Rowan looked down at the stone, then at his hands, then back at the stone. He could open it. Right now. Find out what was underneath. End the question. But another part of him, the part that had kept him alive longer than most, held him still. Not everything needed to be opened the moment you found it. Some things. You waited. Rowan stepped back. "Not tonight," he said. Ash didn't react. But he didn't move away either. He stayed there, guarding or watching. Rowan couldn't tell which. That night, Rowan made a small fire, not in the hearth. Too risky without clearing it first. Instead, he used a metal tray near the center of the room, feeding it with dry wood from outside. The light flickered across the stone walls, bringing out textures he hadn't noticed before. Marks, scratches, subtle signs of use, life. He sat with his back against the wall, legs stretched out, watching the flame. Ash lay near the hearth again, always there. Rowan let the silence settle. Not empty, not heavy, just present. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about where he would go next. Or how long he could stay. He was thinking about something else. Something unfamiliar. Not hope, but maybe the beginning of it. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, the fire burned low. And beneath the stone slab, something waited. Rowan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Still there, still breathing, still here. For now, that was enough. Rowan did not sleep much that night. Not because of fear, but because of awareness. The kind that settled into the body without asking permission. The quiet alertness that came from years of knowing that what you ignored could be what ended you. The small fire he had built burned low by midnight, its glow reduced to a bed of red embers. Shadows stretched long across the stone walls, shifting subtly with every breath of wind that slipped through the gaps in the cabin. Ash remained where he had been since dusk, near the hearth, not pacing, not restless, just present. Rowan sat across the room, back against the wall, arms resting loosely on his knees. He had taken off his jacket, but the cold still seeped through the floor and into his bones. His eyes drifted toward the stone slab, still slightly off, still waiting. He could feel it. Not in any mystical sense, but in the same way he could sense imbalance in a room, a silence that didn't belong, a detail that didn't align. The slab was wrong, and he had left it that way. That had been a decision, one he wasn't entirely sure he trusted. Morning came slowly. Gray light filtered through the windows, soft and diffused. The kind of light that didn't wake you so much as replace the dark. Rowan stood, joints stiff but responsive, and moved toward the hearth. Ash didn't move. That was new. Usually, by now, the dog would stretch, shift, check the perimeter, but not today. Today, Ash stayed seated, eyes forward, watching. Rowan stopped a few feet away. "All right," he said quietly. Not to Ash, to himself. He retrieved the crowbar from where he had leaned it against the wall. It was old, steel worn smooth in places from years of use. Not ideal, but enough. Rowan crouched beside the slab. He studied it again. The edge, the weight, the angle. He slid the tip of the bar into the narrow seam. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he adjusted his grip, shifted his weight, applied pressure, not forcefully, but steadily. The slab resisted. Of course it did. But it wasn't locked. It was resting, balanced, designed that way. Rowan exhaled, then leaned in just slightly more. The stone gave. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough. A small shift, a subtle lift. He froze, listening, nothing. No sound except his own breathing and the faint rustle of wind outside. He continued. The slab rose slowly, heavy and reluctant, tilting just enough for him to wedge the crowbar deeper beneath it. Another push, another inch. It took time and patience. But eventually, the stone lifted enough to reveal darkness beneath. A space. Not a crack, not erosion, a chamber, deliberate. Rowan held the slab in place with one hand, his muscles tightening under the strain, and leaned forward to look inside. Stone-lined, dry, undisturbed. Whatever had been placed there had stayed. He lowered the slab gently, just enough to rest it partially open, then shifted his body closer. Ash stood up, for the first time since morning. He stepped forward, stopping just behind Rowan. Close enough to see, not close enough to interfere. Rowan reached in, his hand brushed against something solid. Fabric, thick, wrapped. He gripped it carefully and pulled it out. A bundle. Oilcloth, darkened with age but intact. He set it on the floor, reached back in. Another object. A small metal box. Then a book. Leather-bound, cracked at the edges. He paused. Looked back into the chamber. There was more. Coins, small objects, something glinting faintly. But he stopped himself. Not all at once. He had learned that, too. Take in what you can process. Leave the rest. Rowan shifted back, easing the slab down just enough to cover the opening again, leaving a small gap. Control. He needed that. The oilcloth bundle came first. He untied the string slowly, fingers steady despite the tension in his chest. Inside, jewelry. Not extravagant, but old, carefully kept. A thin gold chain, a pair of earrings set with dark stones, a locket, small enough to fit in his palm. Rowan turned it over. Didn't open it yet. Next, the metal box. He lifted the lid. Inside were folded bills, old currency, paper worn but preserved. More than he expected. But not enough to change a life overnight. Enough to sustain one. That mattered more. He set the box aside and picked up the book. The leather was dry, edges curled slightly with time. When he opened it, the spine creaked softly. The pages inside were yellowed but intact. Handwritten, ink faded to a soft brown. The first line sat at the top of the page, simple and steady. 1941. My name is Evelyn Whitlock. Rowan's eyes moved slowly across the words. Not rushing, not skimming, reading the way you read something that wasn't meant for you. but had found you anyway. She wrote clearly, no wasted language. She spoke of her husband, of the war, of the decision to leave the cabin and follow him into uncertainty, of fear, not loud, not dramatic, but present in the spaces between sentences. Then the line that anchored everything. I have placed what we could not carry beneath the hearth. Rowan stopped there, looked up, at the stone, at the room, then back at the page. Ash shifted suddenly, not toward the door, not toward the outside, but closer. He lowered his head and pressed his nose lightly against the open page of the journal. Not sniffing, not searching, just touching it. And then he looked up at Rowan. Not alert, not tense, but with a focus that felt almost like recognition, as if whatever was written there wasn't new to him. Rowan held his gaze for a moment, then looked back down at the journal. Something in his chest tightened, not from fear, from familiarity. Not the place, not the woman, the tone, the restraint. The way Evelyn Whitlock wrote about loss as if it were something that had settled into her bones and stayed there. Rowan turned the page. More entries. Dates scattered across years, short passages, fragments of a life lived in waiting. 1943. No letter this month. I have stopped counting the days. 1944. They say this is normal now. Silence is part of the war. Then, 1945. They came to the door. I knew before they spoke. Rowan stopped again. His fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the page. He didn't need more detail. He knew what that meant. He had seen that knock. He had been that knock. The next pages shifted. Not immediately, but gradually. The war ended. But something else began. A quiet that didn't leave. The house is larger now. Not in size, in absence. The fire still burns, but it does not warm the same. Rowan swallowed. He felt it now. Not just understanding. Connection. The kind that didn't ask permission. He turned to the last written page. The ink there was lighter, more faded. The handwriting slightly less steady. 1953. I am leaving the cabin. He read the rest slowly. She wrote of age, of strength that no longer held, of a life that had narrowed to memory. And then, I leave these things not for keeping, but because I cannot carry them any further. Rowan closed the journal, gently. He sat there for a long time. Ash lay down beside him, close enough that Rowan could feel the warmth of his body against his leg. Neither of them moved. Rowan looked at the items again. The jewelry, the money, the journal, the ring. He picked up the ring, a blue stone set in a simple band, worn smooth from years of use. He turned it between his fingers, then set it down. He wasn't thinking about value, not in the way most people would. He was thinking about weight, not physical. Something else. Rowan leaned back slightly, resting against the wall. He let out a slow breath. For the first time since arriving, the cabin didn't feel like a place he had stepped into. It felt like something that had opened. Not wide, not completely. Just enough. Enough to let him see what had been left behind. And why? Ash shifted, adjusting his position, then settled again. Still facing the hearth. Still aware. Rowan followed his gaze. The slab. Still partially covering the opening. Still holding more. He knew there was more down there, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. He had learned something important, not from the war, from the silence that followed it. You didn't take everything at once. You took what you could carry, and you left the rest. until you were ready. Rowan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. The cabin was quiet. Not empty, not abandoned, just holding. And for the first time in a long while, Rowan didn't feel like he was passing through. He felt like he had arrived. Rowan stopped measuring time in hours. The cabin had no clock, no steady rhythm beyond the rise and fall of light through the windows and the slow cooling of stone after sunset. Days blurred, not in confusion, but in quiet repetition, reading, moving, sitting, thinking, and always returning to the journal. He did not read it straight through. He couldn't. Evelyn Whitlock's words were not meant to be consumed like a story. They settled differently. They lingered. Each entry seemed to leave something behind in him, something that didn't move easily once it was there. So Rowan read in pieces, a page in the morning, another by the fire, sometimes just a paragraph, sometimes only a single line. Ash adapted without needing instruction. The German shepherd no longer watched Rowan the way he had those first days. The intensity had softened, replaced by a steadier presence. He still spent most of his time near the hearth, but now he shifted when Rowan moved, lying closer when the man sat with the journal open in his hands, as if proximity mattered. On the third night, Rowan read an entry dated late winter, 1945. The ink had faded more than the earlier pages, but the handwriting remained careful, deliberate. They told me this morning. I thanked them before they finished speaking. Rowan paused. He knew that sentence, not the exact words, but the shape of it, the reflex, the discipline of receiving something unbearable without letting it show. He read on. I had practiced for this moment in ways I did not understand until it came. There are only so many ways a life can turn. He lowered the journal slightly. His eyes shifted, not to the hearth this time, but to the empty space beside it. The place where another chair might have once stood. Or another person. The following entries changed, subtly, not in tone, but in space. There were longer gaps between dates, more blank pages. Words became fewer, and what remained was distilled. The fire still burns, but it is no longer for warmth. I speak less each day, not because I have nothing to say, but because there is no one to hear it. Rowan leaned back against the wall, the journal resting loosely in his hands. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees again, low and steady. He listened to it, then to the silence that followed. He had known that silence before, not in a cabin, not after a war that ended with a signature, but in rooms filled with people where no one said what mattered, in spaces where something had already ended, and no one knew how to name it. The next morning, Rowan stepped outside early. Frost clung to the edges of the grass, catching the light in thin, brittle lines. The clearing felt sharper, more defined. The kind of cold that made everything honest. Ash followed him, moving easily through the chill, breath visible in short bursts. Rowan walked the perimeter of the cabin slowly, checking, not for threats, for continuity. The shed from the day before remained in his mind. But he didn't return to it. Not yet. Some things could wait. Instead, he focused on the cabin itself. The stones, the mortar, the angles. He noticed small things now that he had missed before. Scratches near the doorway, faint grooves in the wood where hands had pushed or pulled over years, marks on the stone floor that suggested movement repeated over time. Patterns. Life, worn into structure. When he stepped back inside, Ash did not go to the hearth immediately. That was new. Instead, the dog paused near the center of the room, watching Rowan, waiting. Rowan crossed to the table, really just a rough plank set across two supports, and set the journal down. He opened it again. Another entry. Later. I have begun to leave things behind, one by one. Not because they are no longer mine, but because they are too heavy to remain with me. Rowan read the line twice, then again. His jaw tightened slightly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the small metal box he had brought from the chamber, opened it. The folded bills inside were still there, unchanged. But now they felt different. Not like opportunity, like weight. Ash moved suddenly, not toward the door, not toward the hearth, but toward Rowan. He stepped closer than usual, close enough that his shoulder pressed lightly against Rowan's leg. Then he did something he hadn't done since they had left the field years ago. He leaned, not for balance, not for warmth, but fully, his weight settling against Rowan in a way that was unmistakable. Trust, or recognition, or something Rowan had not felt in a very long time. And for a moment, Rowan did not pull away. He set the box aside, closed the journal, then opened it again, flipping toward the end. The last entry, the one he had already read once, but not like this. Not after everything that had come before. 1953. I am leaving the cabin. He read each word carefully, not for information, for intention. There is nothing here that I can take, without breaking what remains of it. Rowan's eyes narrowed slightly. He leaned forward, continued. So, I leave it as it is, not preserved, not abandoned, just held. He looked up. The word stayed with him. Held, not stored, not hidden, held. Rowan stood and walked to the hearth. Ash followed, but stopped a step behind him. The stone slab remained slightly offset, the opening still partially concealed. Rowan crouched, not to open it, just to look. He placed his hand flat against the stone, cold, solid, unmoving. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because he understood something he hadn't before. Evelyn hadn't hidden those things, not in the way people hid valuables. She hadn't buried them to keep others out. She had placed them somewhere they could remain without being carried. There was a difference, a quiet one, but real. That afternoon, Rowan drove back toward the road. Not far, just enough to reach the small supply store Daniel Pierce had mentioned in passing, a place that served as both hardware shop and general store for the scattered properties in the area. The building was modest. Wood siding faded by sun, a single gas pump out front, and a hand-painted sign that read, Bellamy Supply. Inside, the air smelled of dust, oil, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. A woman stood behind the counter. She looked up as Rowan entered. Mid-30s, maybe, about 5'6", lean, practical build. Her hair was chestnut brown, pulled into a loose knot at the back of her head, a few strands escaping around her face. Her skin carried the kind of light tan that came from working outdoors, not from leisure. Her eyes were sharp, not unfriendly, but observant. "Morning," she said, voice even. Rowan nodded once. "Morning." She took him in quickly, the jacket, the boots, the way he moved. "New out here," she said. Not a question. Rowan didn't deny it. "Just got in." She tilted her head slightly. "Cabin?" Rowan hesitated a fraction of a second. Then, "Whitlock place." Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise. Recognition. "Didn't think anyone was taking that one," she said. Rowan shrugged. "Was available." She gave a small, almost amused exhale. Available doesn't always mean empty. Rowan met her eyes. There was no challenge in the look, just a statement. He nodded once. "Name's Mara Bellamy," she added, wiping her hands on a cloth before extending one. Rowan shook it. "Rowan." Her grip was firm, practical, not lingering. "Need anything?" she asked. Rowan glanced around. Tools, nails, basic supplies. Roof patch, nails, maybe tarp. Mara nodded. "Back shelf. Take what you need." As Rowan moved, she added almost casually, "Old places like that? They don't like being rushed." Rowan didn't respond, but the words stayed with him. Back at the cabin, Rowan unloaded the supplies slowly. Ash circled once, then returned to the hearth, always there. Rowan set the tarp aside, looked at the stone, then at the journal resting on the table. Then back at the stone again. He didn't move toward it. Not yet. Instead, he picked up a hammer, turned toward the roof. Work first, understanding later. But something had shifted. Not in the cabin, in him. He no longer felt like he had found something. He felt like something had been placed. And he had finally noticed it. The wind moved through the trees again, soft, steady. And for the first time since he had arrived, Rowan didn't feel like he needed to leave. Rowan didn't tell Mara what he had found. Not about the chamber. Not about the journal. Not about the weight that now seemed to sit beneath the stone floor like something alive. He kept it simple. Repairs, supplies, time. That was enough to explain why he kept coming back into town over the next few days. The lawyer's office sat on the edge of a small strip of buildings near the county road. It wasn't much. Just a narrow space with a glass door, a metal plaque reading Harrison and Cole Legal Services, and blinds that filtered the sunlight into thin, tired lines. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The man behind the desk looked up as Rowan stepped in. He was older, late 60s maybe, tall but slightly stooped, as if years of leaning over desks had slowly folded him inward. His hair was thin and silver, combed carefully to one side. His face was narrow, skin pale, with deep lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he had spent a lifetime watching people explain things they didn't fully understand themselves. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was calm, not warm, not cold, just steady. Rowan stepped forward. "I need to verify property contents, ownership, inheritance." The man studied him for a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. "Name?" "Rowan Hale." The man gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." Rowan did. The chair creaked slightly under his weight. "I'm Thomas Harrison," the man said, folding his hands on the desk. "You've got paperwork?" Rowan slid the file across. Thomas adjusted his glasses and began reading. He didn't rush, didn't comment immediately, just read. Then flipped a page, then another. Finally, he leaned back slightly. "The Whitlock cabin," he said. Not a question. Rowan nodded once. Thomas exhaled quietly through his nose. "Been a while since anyone's taken interest in that one." He tapped the edge of the paper with a finger. "Legally speaking, anything found within the structure at the time of transfer belongs to the current title holder, unless there's a documented claim from a surviving heir." Rowan waited. Thomas continued. "There isn't one." He slid the file back. "Not that we've ever found." Rowan's jaw tightened slightly. "So it's mine." Thomas held his gaze. "Legally?" "Yes." A pause, then, more quietly, "That doesn't always answer the other question." Rowan didn't ask what he meant. He didn't need to. The antique dealer was easier. Younger, faster, less interested in history, more interested in value. A man named Evan Cole, mid-40s, broad-shouldered but softened by a life indoors, with thinning blonde hair and a trimmed beard that looked more maintained than natural. His shop was cluttered. Glass cases filled with watches, coins, jewelry, small relics arranged in careful disorder. Evan handled the items Rowan brought with practiced efficiency. The locket, the earrings, the currency, He turned each piece under the light, eyes sharp, fingers precise. "Old," he said. "Well preserved?" He named a price, not low, not extravagant, fair. Rowan nodded. No negotiation. Evan glanced at him. "You're not asking questions?" Rowan shrugged. "Don't need to." Evan smiled faintly. "Most people do." Rowan didn't answer. By the time Rowan drove back toward the cabin, the sun was already dropping behind the tree line. The truck felt heavier. Not physically. Something else. The money sat in a small envelope beside him. Enough to fix the roof. Enough to last the winter. Enough to stay. And that was the problem. The cabin came into view through the trees, just as it had before. Unchanged. Still. Waiting. Rowan parked, shut off the engine, and didn't move for a long moment. Ash sat up right beside him, watching the clearing. Then the cabin. Then Rowan. Back and forth. Reading. Always reading. Rowan picked up the envelope. Turned it over in his hand. He could leave. That was the thought that had followed him all the way back. Not dramatic, not urgent. Just possible. Sell the rest. Take the money. Find somewhere easier, warmer, closer to something resembling a life people understood. No past, no wait, no questions that didn't have answers. He opened the truck door, stepped out. Cold air hit his face. Sharp, clear, real. Ash jumped down beside him. Rowan walked to the back of the truck, opened it, started moving things. Not in a hurry, not frantic, just deliberate. The duffel bag, the tools, the box he never opened. He placed them carefully, prepared. He had done this before, more times than he could count. Leave before anything had the chance to matter. He reached for the last item. The journal. It sat on the passenger seat where he had left it. Rowan picked it up, held it for a moment. Then, without thinking too much about it, he set it down, back on the seat, and closed the door. Ash didn't move. Rowan turned. "Let's go." The dog remained where he was, still. Rowan frowned slightly. "Ash?" Nothing. Ash's ears shifted once, but he didn't step forward. He looked past Rowan, toward the cabin. Not at the door, not at the clearing, at the hearth, through the wall, as if he could see it. Then, slowly, Ash turned and walked away from the truck. Rowan stood there, watching him. The dog didn't run, didn't hesitate. He moved with purpose, crossed the clearing, reached the cabin, pushed through the open door. Gone. Rowan exhaled slowly. "Damn it." He followed. Inside, the air felt colder. Or maybe that was just him. Ash stood in front of the hearth, exactly where he had been, every night. Every morning. Every moment that mattered. He didn't sit this time. He didn't lie down. He just stood, looking at the stone. Rowan stepped closer, stopped beside him. Silence stretched, long, unbroken. The envelope in Rowan's hand felt heavier now. He looked down at it, then at the slab, then at Ash. "You don't care about the money," he said quietly. Ash didn't react. Of course he didn't. Rowan let out a breath that almost became a laugh. "Yeah, didn't think so." He walked past the dog, set the envelope on the table, next to the journal, next to the things he hadn't taken, the things he hadn't sold, the things he didn't fully understand. He stood there for a moment, then reached out, touched the edge of the journal, not opening it, just touching it, as if confirming it was still there. Rowan turned back toward the door, looked out at the fading light, the trees, the path, the direction he had come from, the direction he could still go. Nothing was stopping him. No one. No obligation, no promise, just choice. He looked down at Ash, The dog had finally sat. Calm, certain. Rowan understood something then. Not in words, not clearly, but enough. If he left now, he wouldn't just be walking away from a cabin. He would be walking away from the first place that hadn't asked him to be anything other than what he already was. And that wasn't something he had found anywhere else. Rowan walked to the door, closed it. Not hard, not final, just closed. He turned the latch, a small, simple sound, but it settled something. He moved back into the room, picked up the hammer he had left earlier, looked up at the damaged section of the roof, then back at the hearth, then at Ash. "All right," he said. Not to the dog, not to the house, to himself. "I'll stay." Ash lay down, not in front of the door, not near the truck, but beside the hearth, where he had chosen from the beginning. Outside, the last of the light faded. Inside, Rowan struck a match. A small flame caught, then another, and for the first time, he fed the fire into the hearth. Not the tray, not temporary. The hearth, the place that had held everything before him, the place that still held more. The flames rose slowly, steady, filling the space with warmth that felt different from anything the cabin had known in years. Rowan sat back, watched it burn, not thinking about leaving anymore. Not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not at all. Rowan stayed. The decision did not feel dramatic when it happened. No thunder, no revelation, no speech whispered to the dark. He simply woke before dawn, looked at the cabin walls washed gray by the first thin light, heard Ash breathing near the hearth, and understood that he was still there because he wanted to be. That was new. For years, staying anywhere had always been temporary, a practical delay before the next exit. He knew how to leave places. He knew how to sleep with one ear open, how to pack in under 10 minutes, how to keep his life reduced to what could fit in a truck bed and a duffel. He had built himself around motion because motion kept memory from settling. But this cabin did not ask him to perform survival. It asked him to repair. So he began. The roof first. There was no romance in it, only labor. Rowan climbed with measured care, boots pressing against old beams, gloved hands testing every board before trusting it. The air smelled of pine pitch, damp moss, and old slate warmed by thin autumn sun. From above, he could see the clearing more clearly now. The rough path in, the long grass bending in the wind. The bright northern forest rolling outward in waves of green and silver. It was not a dark place. That mattered. The cabin had sorrow in it, yes, but not rot. Ash stayed below, moving from shadow to light with the tireless awareness of a working dog. The German shepherd's black and tan coat shone when the sun caught it. His compact, muscular frame always ready, always balanced. Sometimes he circled the perimeter. Sometimes he sat at the door and watched Rowan on the roof without blinking. And whenever Rowan climbed down, Ash came close enough to brush his leg, as if confirming he had made it safely back to the ground. By late morning, Rowan had stripped the worst of the damaged shingles and covered the exposed section with a temporary tarp. He stood in the yard, shoulders tight, forearms streaked with dust, and looked at the cabin with the practical dissatisfaction of a man who had fixed one problem only to expose 3 more. The chimney needed mortar work. One window frame was warped. 2 floor stones near the back wall rocked when stepped on. The place was not becoming beautiful. Not yet. It was becoming honest. He drove into town that afternoon for lime mortar, nails, replacement boards, and a glass pane Mara said might fit the eastern window if he was lucky. Bellamy Supply looked the same as it had before. Weathered wood siding, hand-painted sign, the smell of coffee and machine oil clinging to the doorway. Mara stood behind the counter with a pencil tucked behind one ear and a clipboard in hand. She wore the same moss green parka over a gray sweater, dark work pants, waterproof boots, and the expression of someone who had learned that kindness worked better when it came plain instead of pretty. She glanced up as Rowan entered. "You look like you lost a fight with the roof," she said. Rowan set a list on the counter. "Roof says I won." That earned the smallest curve of a smile from her. "Then the roof's a liar." She gathered his supplies without fuss, moving through the store with the easy speed of someone who knew where every nail, every fitting, every scrap of usable material had lived for the last 10 years. Mara was not soft in the obvious ways. She was too practical for that. But there was care in the way she tied the glass pane in old blanket cloth before handing it over. "You'll need someone for the chimney," she said. "I've got hands." So did the man who built the Titanic. Rowan looked at her. Mara shrugged. "I'm saying old stone can kill a confident man faster than winter." She wrote a name and number on the back of his receipt. Elias Boone. "Used to do repair work before his knees quit cooperating," she said. "Lives west of the creek in a place that should have fallen down 20 years ago but hasn't. He knows every old structure in this county, probably remembers half of them by smell." Rowan turned the receipt over once in his fingers. "You know him well?" "Long enough to know he's rude if he likes you and polite if he doesn't." "That sounds useful." "It is." She leaned one elbow on the counter and studied him briefly, not prying, just measuring. "You really staying out there?" Rowan looked toward the window, toward the road beyond it. "For now." Mara nodded like that answer made sense. "For now" is how most real things start. He didn't answer that. He picked up the supplies, paid, and headed for the door. "Rowan," she called after him. He turned. "Don't try to do the chimney alone." He gave a small nod and left. The next morning, he found Elias Boone exactly where Mara said he would be. The old man's house sat low among spruce trees near a narrow creek, half hidden by brush and years of stubborn survival. Smoke curled from a metal pipe at the roof. A dog barked somewhere distant, then fell quiet. Elias himself emerged from the side shed, carrying split wood as if he had been expecting company all morning. He was in his 70s, tall once, but drawn slightly inward now, his back bent just enough to show the cost of work instead of weakness. His canvas jacket was brown and worn shiny at the elbows, with a red flannel shirt beneath it and dark trousers tucked into old boots. His face looked carved from dry cedar, lined, angular, and weather-beaten, with a short, uneven beard gone mostly white. His eyes, though, were alive, sharp and pale, and far younger than the rest of him. He set the wood down and looked Rowan over once, then Ash. "That your dog?" he asked. Rowan nodded. Elias nodded back. "Good eyes on him." "Ash," Rowan said. The old man grunted. "Name fits." He didn't offer his own, so Rowan did not pretend politeness required delay. "Mara sent me. Said you know old chimneys." Elias wiped his hands on his jacket. "I know people who ruin them. Sometimes I arrive in time to stop it." "That a yes?" Elias squinted at him, then at Ash again. The German shepherd stood still, calm but attentive, ears forward. Finally, the old man said, "Whitlock Place?" "Yes." Something almost imperceptible passed through his face. Not fear, not surprise, more like memory pressed under a thumb. "I'll get my tools." They drove back together in Rowan's truck, Elias giving directions only when necessary, and otherwise spending the ride in silence that didn't feel uncomfortable. Ash sat between them like a third kind of conversation. At the cabin, Elias stood in the clearing for a long moment before moving. The old man took in the stones, the repaired roof section, the open door, the bright sky over the trees. When he stepped inside, his pace slowed further. He did not go to the hearth first. He looked at the walls, the beams, the eastern window, the chimney line. But Rowan noticed something. When Elias finally turned toward the hearth, he removed his cap. He examined the chimney, prodded mortar with blunt fingers, muttered a few judgments Rowan could not fully hear. Then he straightened with a quiet groan. "Needs work," he said, "but not rebuilding. Whoever laid this stone knew what they were doing." Rowan nodded. "Can you help?" Elias looked toward the hearth again, then back to Rowan. "I can help if you listen. I do that occasionally. Dogs probably seen it happen more than people have." That was the closest Rowan had heard to humor in a while. It surprised a dry breath of laughter out of him. Ash, hearing the sound, turned his head sharply, as if checking whether it belonged to his handler or to some stranger who had borrowed his voice. While Rowan and Elias sorted tools near the doorway, Ash rose from his place by the hearth and crossed to the far wall under the eastern window. He did not bark. He did not scratch. He simply stood there, nose lifted toward the wood frame, then lowered himself beneath it and stared at the floorboards below, motionless. Elias saw it and went silent. For the first time all morning, the old man lost the easy roughness in his face. "He used to do that too," Elias said quietly. Rowan turned. "Who?" Elias looked not at Rowan, but at Ash. "Her dog." The room seemed to hold that sentence long after it was spoken. Rowan straightened slowly. "Evelyn had a dog?" Elias gave a short nod. "Old shepherd mix, black-backed, tan legs. Not purebred, but smart as sin and loyal enough to shame people." He walked toward the window, stopping a step away from Ash. "Used to sit here when the weather changed, or when someone came up the trail before they were in sight." Rowan felt something shift under his ribs. Not because it was mystical, because it was ordinary, specific, real, the kind of detail no one invents to impress. Elias crouched with care, one hand braced on his knee. Ash allowed him to come close but did not move from his spot. The old man's gaze dropped to the floorboards. "There was a bench here," Elias said. "Evelyn used to keep seed tins under it. Letters too, sometimes. Things she meant to answer and never did." He stood again, slower this time. "I was 12 when I first met her. She gave me bread and sent me home with potatoes because she thought my mother looked tired. She wasn't sentimental, didn't talk much, but she noticed what people lacked." Rowan leaned against the table, arms folded, listening. "Did she leave suddenly?" he asked. Elias took off his gloves, finger by finger. "No. That's the strange mercy of it. She left slowly, year by year. First the garden went wild. Then the smoke in winter stopped showing every day. Then some weeks, not at all. By the time she finally left, half the county had already been saying goodbye for years." He looked toward the hearth again. That house got too full for one person. Rowan said nothing, because he understood exactly what the old man meant. They worked through the rest of the day. Elias mixed mortar in a steel pan and showed Rowan how to pack it without smothering the joints. "Old stone needs room to breathe," he said. "Treat it like concrete and it'll punish you." Rowan listened. He followed instructions. His hands found rhythm in the work quickly, but what surprised him was how much he wanted the lesson, wanted to get it right. Mara arrived near noon in a battered pickup with extra boards tied down in the bed. She stepped out carrying sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, as if she'd planned not to make a gesture of it. "For the men pretending not to be hungry," she said. Elias snorted. "Speak for yourself." Mara looked around the cabin, then at Rowan's progress. "Looks less like it's waiting to collapse." "That's the dream," Rowan said. She handed him a sandwich. Their fingers touched briefly. Nothing more than accident. but it carried the strange intimacy of shared work. Not romance. Not yet. Just the quiet human relief of being seen in the middle of effort. By evening, the chimney stood straighter, the window frame had been reinforced, and one section of floor had stopped rocking underfoot. The cabin still needed more than Rowan could list, but the changes were visible now. So was something else. When the light softened and Mara had gone and Elias was packing his tools, Rowan found himself standing in the center of the room, without the familiar urge to leave it. He walked to the rough table after dark and opened a notebook he'd bought in town that morning without thinking too hard about why. Its pages were blank and clean and almost offensive in their emptiness. For a long time he just looked at them. Then he wrote one line. The chimney held. He waited. Then another. Ash slept after the fire was lit. Then another. Mara wraps glass like it's breakable because she assumes most things are. He stopped there. Not because he had nothing else to say, because that was enough for one night. Ash settled by the hearth as usual, forelegs stretched out, chin resting on them, eyes half closed, but still aware. Rowan sat with the notebook open on his knee, listening to the low sound of the fire he had built inside the old hearth again. The cabin was changing. The roof, the mortar, the window, the floor, but the deeper change was harder to name. For the first time in years, Rowan was not merely enduring a place. He was beginning to belong to one. And somewhere in that small, stubborn house, under stone and memory and the warmth of returning fire, that seemed to matter. Winter did not arrive all at once. It announced itself in small, deliberate ways. The sharpness in the morning air, the way frost clung longer to the grass, the silence that settled earlier each evening as the sun slipped behind the trees. Rowan noticed all of it, not because he was looking for it, but because, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't trying to ignore anything. The cabin held the cold better now. The patched roof no longer whispered with every gust of wind. The chimney drew smoke cleanly upward, the repaired mortar holding firm under heat. The window on the eastern wall caught the pale winter light and gave it shape, instead of letting it scatter uselessly across broken glass. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough to stay. Enough to breathe. That afternoon, Rowan sat on a rough wooden bench just outside the cabin door. He had built it himself 2 days earlier from leftover boards. Nothing precise, nothing polished. Just something to sit on that didn't remind him of leaving. The forest stretched in front of him, bright even under the thinning light. Pines swayed slowly, their tops catching what little warmth the sun still offered. The ground had begun to harden, the first signs of frozen soil creeping in where the shade held longest. Ash lay beside him. The German shepherd had settled into a different rhythm now. The restless alertness of the first days had eased into something quieter. His body still carried that same coiled readiness, but it no longer drove him to watch every corner at once. Now, he chose. He watched what mattered. And right now, that was Rowan. The dog rested on his side, front legs stretched forward, head lowered but not fully asleep. His ears flicked occasionally at distant sounds, wind, branches, something moving far beyond sight. But he did not get up. He stayed. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low in the hearth. Not roaring, not weak, just steady. Rowan could feel its warmth even from where he sat outside. It reached him in slow waves, moving through the open doorway, mixing with the cold air in a way that felt balanced. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. His hands were rougher now. Not from fighting, from building, from lifting wood, mixing mortar, carrying stone. He looked at them for a moment, then let his gaze drift back toward the doorway. The journal sat on the shelf above the hearth. He had moved it there a few days ago. Not out of reverence, not out of fear. Just where it felt right. It belonged in the room. Not hidden, not buried again, held. Rowan stood slowly and stepped back inside. The shift in temperature wrapped around him immediately. The warmth of the fire, the stillness of stone, the faint scent of ash and old wood that had begun to feel less like residue and more like presence. Ash followed him in without being called. He circled once near the hearth, then settled down on the stone floor, closer than before, but no longer positioned as if guarding anything. Just resting. Rowan walked to the shelf and picked up the journal. The leather felt familiar in his hands now. Not fragile, not sacred, used. He opened it without searching. Let the pages fall where they would. Then turned slowly until he found the last entry again. He had read it more than once, but not like this. Not after the days that had come between. His eyes moved across the line. If you found this, you probably needed it. He stayed there, not reading forward, not reading back, just there. Ash shifted. Not suddenly, not sharply. He rose from where he lay and walked toward Rowan, his movement quiet, deliberate. He stopped closer than usual, and then did something simple. He lowered his head and rested it gently on Rowan's knee. No tension, no alertness, no purpose beyond being there. And in that moment, Rowan understood something that had nothing to do with the journal. Ash wasn't waiting anymore. Rowan exhaled slowly. His hand moved almost on its own, resting on the dog's neck, fingers pressing lightly into the thick fur. Warm, alive, present. He looked down at the journal again, then back at the fire. Evelyn hadn't left instructions, not in the way people expected. No maps, no claims, no requests to pass things on or to preserve them for history. She hadn't asked for anything. She had simply placed what she could no longer carry somewhere it would remain. Not for someone to take, for someone to understand. Rowan closed the journal, not with finality, just enough. He set it back on the shelf, stepped back, looked at the room, the hearth, the stone slab, the space beneath it. All still there, unchanged, but no longer unanswered. Rowan moved to the center of the room and stood still. He thought about the war, not in images, not in specific moments, but in weight. The kind that stayed long after the sound was gone. The kind that didn't leave when you left. For years he had carried it, not because he wanted to, because he didn't know where else to put it. And everywhere he went, it followed. Not loud, not visible, but always there. He looked at the hearth again, the place Evelyn had chosen. Not to hide, not to protect, to set something down. Rowan stepped closer, not to open it, not to take anything out, just to stand there, to feel it, to acknowledge it. Ash remained at his side, quiet, steady, no longer watching the hearth, no longer waiting for something to happen. Rowan lowered himself to sit on the stone floor, back against the wall, facing the fire. Ash settled beside him, body relaxed, breathing slow. For a long time, neither of them moved. The fire crackled softly, sending occasional sparks upward, shadows shifting across the walls. The room held them. Not tightly, not possessively, just enough. Rowan's thoughts didn't race, didn't pull him away. They came and went, like the wind outside. And for once, he didn't try to stop them. Didn't try to organize them. Didn't try to outrun them. He let them settle. Time passed. Minutes, maybe hours. It didn't matter. At some point, Rowan realized something. Not all at once. Not like a revelation. More like a quiet alignment. The cabin had not been waiting for him. Not specifically, not by name, not by fate. It had been waiting for someone who understood what it meant to carry something too long. Someone who knew the difference between holding on and holding something in place. He looked down at Ash. The dog had closed his eyes, fully at rest now. No tension, no vigilance, just sleep. Rowan leaned his head back against the wall, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. The fire still burned, the room still held, and for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about leaving. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. But the thought settled anyway. Clear, quiet, certain. The cabin didn't wait for him. It waited for someone like him. There are moments in life when we think we've been forgotten. Moments when the weight we carry feels too heavy, too quiet, too invisible for anyone else to understand. We move from place to place, from day to day, believing we are simply surviving, when in truth, we are still searching. But sometimes, God does not answer with a voice. Sometimes he answers with a place, a moment, a path that doesn't make sense at first, a door that opens when you have nowhere left to go. Rowan did not find that cabin by accident. He found it because, in a way only God understands, it was time for him to stop carrying everything alone. And maybe you needed to hear this story today for the same reason. Because there are things in your life you were never meant to carry forever. Pain, regret, loss, silence. They don't disappear overnight. But God, in his quiet and patient way, gives us places, people, and moments where we can finally begin to set them down. Not all at once, just enough, just for today. So if this story touched something in your heart, take a moment. Think about what you've been holding on to for too long, and ask yourself, what if you don't have to carry it alone anymore? If this message spoke to you, share it with someone who might need it too. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what you're ready to let go of. And if you believe in stories that remind us we're not alone, subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories so you don't miss the next one. May God bless you, guide you, and bring peace to whatever you are carrying tonight.